did you initially decide to get tattooing because you believed it was the evolutionary endpoint of people from Essex?
Yeah, it's in my DNA, Thomas.
Yeah,
deeply etched in my DNA.
Yeah,
my
if
genes told me to do it.
Yeah, you were the fifth lad for the four lads in jeans. They forgot to put your statue in, though.
Oh no, I'm like I'm taking the Jordan Peterson approach, right? I saw the tattoo in the kind of cosmic symbology and decided to connect myself with the spiritual map of meaning.
Mm-hmm. And you,
it's very complicated. You wouldn't understand.
No, definitely not, because I don't have a PhD. And you used your wonderful insight to pursue a PhD and fulfill the end point of everyone taking a mild interest into an obsession. And then, thank God, you didn't create a load of shit science around it, like some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. But you're very welcome to Beneath Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. I'm one of your hosts, Tom Somahany, and I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder. And we have another expert, another PhD haver on the episode as well. Matt, would you like to introduce our guest and what we're talking about?
Yeah, well, I'm really, really pleased to welcome to the show Dr. Kat Ford, who currently is working as a teaching fellow teaching associate at the University of Aston in Birmingham. Got a PhD from Brunel University, somewhere where I nearly went, actually. And they offered me funding, so I quit my job, moved to Uxbridge, and then the day before term started, they told me they didn't have any funding after all. I had to go and beg for my job back. Yeah,
no.
that was like 10, 15 years ago. No, yeah, probably like 2005. So yeah, that was fun.
That doesn't sound like a gut punch at all.
Yeah, that was my sort of intro to academia, that. But yeah, so Kat, I mean, I guess, like, do you want to introduce yourself as well and like talk about what it is you do? I mean, I first encountered you on the Merseyside Skeptics podcast, Skeptics with a K, who we love, and yeah, I just love to know, who you are and what you're doing, and how you got to what you're doing right now.
So I'm Kat. What am I is a really great question, because I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question anymore. For the longest time, I would have been very, very happy to introduce myself to people and say, I'm an evolutionary psychologist. Now I kind of err more towards evolutionary behavioral scientist. And one, it just helps me sidestep a lot of the negative perceptions people have immediately of somebody who says evolutionary psychology. But it does, to some extent, also reflect changes in my approach, I guess. Because depending on who you are, what you mean by evolutionary psychology can mean slightly different things. And there is more than one school of evolutionary psychology. One of the most famous is probably the Santa Barbara School of Evolutionary Psychology. And that sort of approach very much tends to think about brains like a Swiss Army knife. You've got all these kind of adaptations that are already there, fully loaded, and they come into play at the right time and come offline when they're not needed. I think possibly for some things that probably works, but I don't think that is the totality of explaining human behaviour, because it's much more complicated than that. And there's interesting things, that you can learn through sort of a more sort of behavioural ecology approach, or and I think cultural evolution is a really fascinating area that can tell us a lot about surprisingly complicated, or not surprisingly complicated behaviours, but it can be a really insightful approach. And I think ultimately, the thing that drives me towards this kind of area is a kind of Like, it sounds like a real cop-out because it's a point that you can't really
We're
argue
academics.
with too much.
We're built on cop-outs. It's okay.
Right. So, like, I think that, like, the sort of the thing that most people would probably quite happily agree with is that humans are animals. We evolved. We have brains. A brain is just an organ, and that is going to have been shaped by natural selection.
Yeah, that's the kind of like that's the very basic kind of Mott and Bailey, the Bailey. Well, I can't remember which way around it goes, but that's the kind of like truism at the heart of all of this stuff, right? The kind of undeniable bit of it.
Yeah, but then it's a question of like, okay, well, how do we figure out which behaviors are kind of born out of some sort of evolutionary history, and how much does knowing that how much can that actually tell us about humans and what they do, and how often is that actually useful as an explanation?
Yeah.
My answer to that is always, eventually. But it might, like, so sometimes the explanation will just simply be because human brains are really good at learning because learning is useful.
Right. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
I guess the kind of version that gets a bad name or has gotten a bad name is the version that is the kind of of the sort of Jordan Peterson kind, actually, which is, you know, women wear red lipstick because men evolved to like collect red berries on the savannah and therefore they're attracted to finding berries. Like, that's the kind of like stereotypical form of that very kind of problematic form of evolutionary psychology, right? Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, I've actually been at a conference where somebody had a poster of a similar idea. And I wish I could remember the details of it because one hypothesis is that lipstick is used because your lips and your labia, if you have them, tend to blush in the same way at the same time. And so by wearing red lipstick, you're making people think about sexual arousal because, oh, her face lips are red, her downstairs lips must be red too. Somebody had tried to investigate this, and so as part of their research, they had just watched loads of porn to see if there was any sort of relationship between like upstairs and downstairs lip coloration during sexual arousal, and they found no.
Turns out,
you know, good on them for trying.
Because yeah, I mean, as a broadly a cultural historian, you know, and this is what we'll get into when we talk about tattooing, I'm sort of interested in just how the really kind of hard versions of that methodology are completely acultural, right? They kind of seek, and I guess there are different versions of it which come at it from bottom up and top down, but like ultimately they seek to kind of find ways to explain culture through what looks to me like a naturalistic fallacy or a naturalistic overdetermination at the very least, right? To sort of say culture is like it is because it had to be because science, you know?
Yeah, but you do sometimes get really interesting examples where culture and biology are really closely linked. So one of my, like, I've got loads of favorite like little examples of stuff. In certain areas in Fiji, there are local groups that have really strong taboos about women eating seafood during pregnancy. And that seemed, on the face of it, that's like, okay, that's a really strange cultural thing that they've got there. What does that mean? Anything? Is it just one of those quirks that sometimes cultures have their own little quirks? Well, actually, those groups that have those taboos experience seafood food poisoning at 60% less frequency than areas that don't have those taboos. So it's not that those people had this genetic understanding that these fish were dangerous. It's that this taboo kind of crept in, and then people were kind of healthier, so the taboo carried on, because this cultural change ended up having a physiological benefit to people that believe in that taboo.
Oh, that's such a perfect example, because that's an example of your eventually, right? Like, we get to that biological eventually. Like, it's not the reductive version is like biology creates the taboo, but actually it's this particular. There's a couple of steps in the middle there, and then a reinforcement mechanism over time, right? Sorry, Tom.
It's like that age-old kind of saying is like, you don't need to understand how fire works to understand it will burn you. You just got to stick your hand in it once.
Right. Yeah.
Like, you don't need to understand necessarily like with the seafood, that like all of the internal mechanics that lead to, okay, you might get food poisoning, which then has like knock-on effects. You just need to understand that, if you eat it, you might get sick, so maybe don't.
Yeah, you don't even need to understand that. You just have to know that there is a rule that says I don't do that, and I'm not going to break the rules. And that's enough.
Yeah. So the reason we wanted to get you on the show, Kat, is because this sort of topic of like tattooing as a evolutionary product, or even in the 19th century for early kind of proto-scientific racists, this idea that tattooing was indicative of sort of where you were on the evolutionary timeline as a culture. This stuff comes up a lot. And there was a thread, the sort of real impetus for this was a thread that someone atted me in on Twitter, RIP, by a guy called Nutrition Detective, the classic kind of fodder.
I find apples.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he got a license for those lemons. Yeah. But basically he did this whole thread about like how tattoos were terrible, and then kind of was retrofitting with like news articles and some sort of scientific surveys and scientific papers about how tattooing was very bad for you. One of them was I'll read you his tweet, right? So he says 6 out of 10 US voters say tattoos make a person less attractive. Is there a plausible biological reason for this? There is. It's called aposematism. Aposematism is a term used to describe the use of bright coloration to advertise an organism is dangerous or unpalatable. We have an instinctual warning system. Bright, strong, dark colors equals toxic or dangerous. So, what do you think about that? What do you think about that?
Everyone's head is in their hands as Matt is reading that.
I've got several tattoos and nobody's ever tried to cannibalize me. So, therefore, you must be onto something.
Do nectar gathering insects cross the road when they see you coming?
Yes, but that's a different story. Yeah. So it's a really interesting, just in that, interesting problem that does crop up over and over again, of people sort of going, well, this happens in animals, therefore, definitely must happen in humans. And sometimes it is just like really silly examples like that of like, well, if you've got brightly coloured hair, you must be a toxic person. It's like, well, okay, you're misunderstanding what toxicity is. like, fine, don't ingest them then. Also, I think we all know that colour isn't natural. And like a lot of that you're talking about, we're talking about natural production of these colours. I mean, not everything that has a certain colour or a certain colour pattern will be toxic in the same way either. Like, because you get things in nature like mimicry, where you'll get species of butterflies that have similar coloration and patterns to a different species of butterfly that is toxic, but that first one isn't toxic, but they kind of get the protective benefit of looking toxic. So there's that. And it is just that, like I said, that thing of going, well, if animals do it, humans are animals, we must do it too. And a really dark example of that is in a lot of animal species, especially if it's depending on how they mate, how their mating system is. If it's like a male controlling a harem of females, an incoming male might fight off the male that's currently in control and then kill as many babies as possible, because that will speed up the process of the females coming into heat and reproducing again. And that's not a universal thing through animals, but there are some famous examples like lions and I think langur monkeys. And so it's not unusual to hear people say, like, well, I wonder if that happens in humans, because every now and again you will get a story of a step-parent neglecting or even outright abusing stepchildren. It's not actually that common. It's not common enough that you can go, well, that's adaptive, or that's an adaptation. And there's been plenty of research looking at that specific hypothesis of, are step-parents more likely to injure stepchildren? And the answer is very, very, very slightly.
Yeah.
Very slightly. And
because
the
I guess
biggest risk is not that they will actively harm, but there will be small, especially if they've got their own children, they might not pay quite as much attention to their stepchildren as they do to their own children.
But there are as many
so
cultural, and there are as many cultural potential reasons for that, or even individual reasons for that, as there are quote unquote biological ones. I mean, I think that a lot of this stuff starts with the conclusion, right? Like this natural detective guy, like the conclusion, I don't like tattoos. Why don't I like them? Must be the bright colors. Why don't I like bright colors? Because toxic. Like it's sort of working back, like the inference chain is working backwards, right, from your conclusion, which is quite problematic in lots of ways, right?
Yeah. And it's absolutely fine to look at nature and look at other animals and go, oh, that's an interesting quirk. This seems to be why they do that. I wonder if humans do the same thing. As long as you're willing to do the research properly, going into it, I need to design a test that will help me disprove this hypothesis. And then when the results come back and it shows your hypothesis is wrong, you go, oh, wow, okay, guess I was wrong about that. Let's move on.
So what do you think we can learn then, right, about tattooing from the kind of methodologies that you're working with? Like what is there, if we're not talking about, are tattoos toxic? Do we not like tattooed people because we don't want to ingest them because toxic flowers? Like, if that's not the right way to do it, like what do you think we can learn, or what is there to be learned, what has been learned, I guess, as well, about the relationship between tattooing and evolution?
So with that example of why don't we like people with tattoos? It's like, well, is that true?
Yeah.
Is that
well, I
is
will
that
have,
true in our society?
I will have to say that, Nutri-Detect goes on to say, when talking about toxic and dangerous, tattoos, is that tattoos have been previously linked to high-risk behavior such as drug use, sexual promiscuity, mental health disorders such as depression and subsequent suicidality, aberrant personality traits, including a lack of sociability and reduced inhibition, psychopathy, and schizophrenia. All of these have been associated with violent and early deaths. And I feel like you're reaching quite a lot in this assumption, Nutri-Detect. Also, the fact there is no evidence cited with this claim, unlike every other claim he makes, where he seems to have grabbed random, research studies to support it.
Yeah, that's a lot of things that he's saying that there's a relationship with. And also, even if those relationships are there, the next question is like, okay, well, how strong are they? And especially when you're talking about those kind of relationships, or any sort of relationship between, let's say people who are over 6 foot, really love jigsaws. Like, on average, like there's a correlation between height and jigsaw enjoyment. That might be true at a very big group level when you're asking loads and loads of people. But one, the strength of the relationship could be quite weak. Two, and the really important thing is, look, if you found that relationship, assuming that everyone over 6 foot bloody loves jigsaws is incredibly foolish. And I think that's kind of one of the problems with psychological research in general, is the research often goes, there's a bit of a sort of general trend here if you look at a big group of people. And everyone else goes, well, that sounds like a fact. Sound.
Yeah, and that's the stuff that gets in the newspapers and the press releases and then into the popular imagination, right? Like the red lip thing that I mentioned earlier on, that's definitely a kind of factoid, I think they get called, right? Like, where people sort of heard that somewhere. It sounds sort of sciencey enough. And I think, I mean, with tattooing, of course, like the associations, particularly in Europe, as I talk about a lot, like they change really rapidly depending on what the colonial situation is. Like in the 16th and 17th centuries, it's like tattooing makes us just like everybody else. Like we're more along the evolutionary timeline from these people in the New World. And then we get to the 19th century and it's like, these people are subhuman because they have tattoos and we do not have them and we're different from them. So like the sort of rhetorical tools that these things get talked about, whilst using the same kind of scientific or pseudoscientific, in lots of cases, methodological frameworks, is really, really fascinating. And that kind of careful, as you said, Kat, like looking at it properly and seeing actually what is the data actually telling us and what are the mechanisms in action here and does this make any sense? Like that's the step that people seem to miss.
Yeah. And so the paper that you sent me.
Yeah, so this is a paper which came out in March 23. And again, this was a kind of proximate cause for inviting Kat on. Tattooing as a Phenotypic Gambit by Christopher D. Lynn et al. Lynn is at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, and it was published in the American Journal of Biological Anthropology. So yeah, this paper, I mean,
for everyone at home, you should have seen Matt's reaction when I sent it when this first came up. I was reading this on the overground home today, and at one point exclaimed, "Oh, please fuck off," out loud. So yeah, this paper, I'll just read the abstract, right? So it says, tattooing is not an evolved behavior, but maybe a phenotypic gambit to highlight immunological health. Phenotypic gambits are traits or behaviors that appear costly but occur at high rates as a honing process of natural selection, not constrained by genetics. Tattooing is an ancient practice that is increasing in popularity worldwide, but it involves wounding the body, which seems counterintuitive because it challenges the immune system and makes one more susceptible to infection. But, and this is their kind of theory, tattooing may represent a costly, honest signal of fitness by upping the ante in an era of hygiene, or a mean to stimulate the immune system in a way that improves and highlights underlying fitness. So can you explain kind of what that means and what you make of it, Kat, with your professional head on?
So it's difficult because they get dangerously close to saying something that I think might be right.
Right.
But they kind of just swerve it at the last minute, in my opinion. So probably need to define what a phenotype is just for anyone that isn't into that. So you've got your genotype, and that is basically your genes. What type of genes you've got, what's going on in your cells. But obviously, from the outside, animals can't see each other's genetic profile. We can't see how, like, quote unquote, healthy somebody's genes are. The closest approximation we've got is their outward appearance and behaviour, and that's their phenotype. So where I think they get quite close to something interesting is this idea of a costly, honest signal.
Right.
Costly signals are really fascinating. And I definitely think ideas around costly signaling can be interesting when looking at tattoos. But I think it's not going to be costly signals of physiological health. It's going to be a more cultural costly signal.
So a costly signal would be like an animal using energy that it would otherwise kind of quote unquote rationally be conserving for eating and surviving to like make a beautiful nest or particular ostentatious display or things like that. Is that right? Is that what a costly signal is?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's loads of really great examples of it. The classic one is a peacock. And the general thought there is the peacock's kind of looking around and going, look at my silly fucking tail. It's heavy, it's unwieldy, it makes me so obvious to predators. Now, if I wasn't such a brilliant specimen of a Mr. Peacock, would I really survive into adulthood while dragging this fucking thing around? And so the peahens then go, oh, wow, yes, good point. You must be amazing at escaping predators. You must be really good at eating and gaining enough energy to be able to fly around with that thing. Let's have sex, and we'll have very sexy children. And
I could fight you with one hand tied behind my back kind of thing.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Of like, I'm so brilliant at this, I can handicap myself and still beat you. So it is referred to as the Harvey's handicap principle. That's why I used that specific phrase, which is not nice, but that's what it's called because it was an idea come up with in the 70s, which was, a great time for everyone.
I can't believe this is the first time I'm learning that the female version of a peacock is a peahen.
Did you not know that?
Do you think it was a lady peacock?
I just thought they were both called peacocks. Like, I don't know.
Or a pea fanny?
Maybe. Pea fanny. We were going to petition the Biological Society of England to change it to pea fanny.
Although that would really confuse Americans, because that just means arse.
So this paper is basically trying to prove that they say that there's two hypotheses to explain how short-term harm could be evolutionarily adaptive. One, its popularity is a result of sexual selection favoring ornamentation for symbolic communication, the human canvas hypothesis. And this second one, being tattooed comes with physiological costs that can highlight immunological health, the upping the ante hypothesis. Previous research indicates that tattooing might reflect fitness advantages by highlighting attractiveness, bilateral symmetry, depends how good your tattoo is, I guess. Et cetera. So they're trying to work with this physiological cost hypothesis, and they're testing it by doing saliva samples on quite a small number of people, 40 people, and testing their saliva to see if their saliva indicates more immune response.
Yeah, so
right?
it's testing the cortisol response in both pre-test and post-test, so pre-tattooing and post-tattooing. But the methodological problem in that is that like cortisol response in reaction to any sort of physical strains, either like physical trauma sustained in something like tattooing or something similar, which this is why I know about it, is like going to the gym. So like you will have a cortisol response.
You're so buff, Tom.
In response to sustained physical strain. So that can either be through the adrenal response when receiving skin trauma through tattooing, or similar the adrenal response when you are like lifting very heavy weights, and cortisol is released into the muscles in response to this trauma. So varying levels of cortisol are used to combat physical pain.
So, I mean, before we sort of look specifically at what they're testing, there's a more general problem of one, saliva's not that great for testing what's going on in somebody's body. Like blood is more accurate, but it's a little bit harder to get hold of, and you've got to do more forms. There's more ethics involved, usually some training, because not everyone can go around stealing blood, apparently. It's very annoying. And then there's the fact that, like, spit can... well, I mean, just not with university approval. I mean, just be really sneaky about it. No, don't steal people's blood. That's bad.
Don't tell Dracula that. Stealing people's blood is wrong. This is a pro-vampire podcast.
I can just imagine somebody telling that to Dracula and him go, "Oh, drat." I always thought what I was doing was incredibly ethical.
I'm going to do a PhD on the ethics of Dracula sustaining his own life. How do we create ethical vampires? Who knows?
Oh no, okay, we're not opening that box. My brain has an answer for you, but it's disgusting. Or at least quite weird. So we'll carry on with the science. Yeah, so saliva can quite easily get contaminated as well. So there's quite a lot of research that looks into masculinity and testosterone, which again frequently uses spit samples and then finds that really manly men have higher testosterone. One big problem with that is that testosterone is easier to detect in blood. And if you are living a rough and tumble lifestyle, which would... So not manly men, that was probably the wrong phrasing, but sort of people who are more impulsive and make decisions that might be good in the short term, but bad in the long term, stuff that we'd refer to as like having a high rate of future discounting. The research using spit to see if mouthy wet testosterone levels correlate with that kind of behaviour might find a positive correlation. But if you're living that rough and tumble lifestyle, you're more likely to have damaged gums. So you're more likely to have small levels of blood in your saliva, which could artificially increase the amount of testosterone that's detected in your spit.
Oh, wow.
So,
and particularly if you're looking at an N of 40 and you're making your hypotheses on 40 people, that those kind of even potential contaminations can really affect your data sets, right?
Yeah.
I mean, does it sound, I guess, like the question, this is maybe what you were alluding to at the beginning when you come onto this, like, do you think even the hypothesis that tattooing, sort of persist, I guess the most charitable version of this would be like persisted as a cultural practice because it conferred some kind of survivability or some fitness. Like, is that itself a plausible hypothesis, do you think, like, given what you know about how cultural practices have evolved? I mean, talking analogous, I guess, in some ways to the shellfish example you mentioned earlier. Like, does it even seem plausible as a hypothesis?
To an extent.
Yeah.
So one of the big problems so the concept that one might engage in activities that outwardly seem harmful in some way could convey some sort of benefit is plausible. Especially with sort of religion research, you actually see a fair bit of this, of people engaging in really potentially costly activities, whether it's body modification, long pilgrimages, those kind of, like, publicly putting yourself in a dangerous situation or publicly harming yourself. But it's not because those things will immediately result in you showing off something about your immune system or anything physiological. That's probably better interpreted as a costly signal or something that's referred to as an inferentially potent display of your commitment to those beliefs.
Yeah.
Which then
that would be a great name for a tattoo shop if anyone's looking for a new name for their shop. Inferentially potent display. It'd be a great name for a tattoo studio. Yeah, because I guess the basic idea is, like, if it killed you, right? If tattooing was really harmful people wouldn't do it, right? Or it wouldn't be as widespread, and it wouldn't be as culturally persistent over 5,500 years or whatever. But if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's more that actually, because it doesn't kill you, even though it does clearly have some risk, I think the risks are probably overblown in some of this research in terms of infection and healing time and stuff. But like, there clearly is a kind of, there is a kind of health implication here. But this hypothesis of the indicativeness of immunological health, or at least the kind of fact that it doesn't sort of negatively affect that. That's one reason, in part, for explaining tattooing's persistence as a practice over time. Is that fair? I don't know.
Possibly. So one of the really difficult things about evolution research is one feature can have more than one function.
Yeah.
And it can have more than one function depending on the context. So if we take a human mouth, that has, you can use that for breathing, eating, fighting, mating, making friends. It has all of those functions. So to go, your mouth is for breathing.
Yeah.
It's well, I mean, yes, no, you're not,
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's another kind of key feature of that naturalistic fallacy, right? Like X is for Y, or we are evolved to do X, or we are evolved to do Y. That's not how this works.
Yeah. And then the flip side, the other thing that's kind of curious about studying evolution is sometimes the adaptation looks different in different contexts, but serves the same function. So language is probably the best example of this. Is we know being able to talk is an adaptation, and we know this because it's universal. All humans, unless there's some sort of there's deafness or some sort of physiological problem, all humans talk. Children will develop speech in a really predictable way. They'll start babbling, then they'll start picking up certain words, then they'll start constructing sentences, and then they'll start to get to grips with grammar, and that'll develop in a predictable way. And that they pick it up really easily. You don't have to really teach kids to talk. As long as they're exposed to it enough, they kind of pick it up and understand the meaning. So we know language is an adaptation, but depending on what culture you're in, it can sound incredibly different, because although that adaptation's there, in different cultural contexts, it'll be expressed differently, and that's your different languages. And it can happen with behaviours of you'll look at something and go, well, that behaviour is really strange, and then dig into it and go, oh, it's serving the same function as this behaviour that I'm really familiar with. It's solving the same problem of survival or reproduction. So that's another difficult one. So back to, do I think tattoos can be seen as purposefully injuring yourself to show off your immune strength? Not in our culture. Really unlikely, because it's just not that dangerous in our culture. And I did try and do research to find if this question's been asked, but I have terrible time management skills. But I could believe that in cultures where there are, or areas of the world where there's high risk of pathogen stress, that maybe extreme scarification could be indicative of, and how that heals, could give you a bit of an insight of how healthy that person is, how good their immune system function is. Or it could, even be that somebody...
And therefore makes them more sexually attractive, right? That's the other important step, that it's not just indicative, it also then increases their kind of reproductive fitness, right?
Yeah, potentially. Or it could even be that that it doesn't really show immune system function, but it might show pain tolerance.
Yeah.
And there might hypothetically be some sort of relationship between the amount of physical punishment you can take and how good you are at like hunting or how good you are at making war. And that in turn could affect your perceived mate value in that cultural context. That story, that hypothesis, if there was evidence to support it, I could believe that.
Yeah.
But
well, I guess this is the question as well, right? About, because I think, this particular paper that we've been talking about, I don't think in terms of the evidence it isn't very convincing. And I end up, I guess, is like, I think this kind of impulse to try and kind of understand why people would do this strange thing to themselves comes out of, as you said, like a pretty normative place, right? It comes out of this position of trying to understand why a particular culture that is kind of quote unquote not ours, and ours meaning the kind of white European scientific establishment historically, and then it kind of, without the kind of evidence of the kind you're talking about, sort of gets to its conclusions anyway, and that's what. And then from those conclusions, like as I said before we came on, like the earliest like criminological writing about tattooing sort of reads tattoos on criminals in the Italian prison system as indicative of them being almost a different species of human, more like the savages of Africa in inverted commas than kind of contemporary 19th century Italians, because those, again, in quotes, savages in Africa have tattoos. We Europeans don't have tattoos. Therefore, this is indicative that this person is, almost different from us. And like that ignores the fact that Europeans have been tattooing just as long as people everywhere else, pretty much. As far as the oldest preserved tattoos we have are European. And it kind of starts from that not even faulty premise, but faulty conclusion. They want to kind of justify the status quo essentially and work backwards. I think like what I found super interesting about the discussion on this paper particularly is like, actually there is something interesting here potentially, but like in a way we can't know it from the data that's presented here because alternative hypotheses aren't considered. And actually, even if that is a kind of genesis, it's certainly not the reason people are getting tattooed now, right?
Yeah, and like I think there's some of the writing in it, like the internal logic seems a bit odd as well. Like they're sort of like, well, the world we're living in is so clean and so hygienic. We need to invent new ways to challenge our immune systems to show just how healthy we are. So we're getting tattoos more and more. It's like, well, maybe we're getting tattoos more and more because it's safe. Because it is safe to do that. And if we really want to run around showing off our great immune system, why aren't we just licking bricks and like chopping fingers off, Like, why tattoos specifically?
That's almost like the reverse. It's almost having your cake and eat it, right? Now you've said that. It's like people got tattooed because it wasn't safe. And now people are getting tattooed because it is safe. And it's the same reason. And you're like, okay.
Why don't we lick bricks is definitely going to be the episode title. Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible, help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month. And you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on this chance to ruin Thomas's body forever.
Everyone knows that tattoo aftercare is one of the most important steps in getting a new tattoo. We all want our fresh new tattoos to heal as easily and hassle-free as possible so we can show them off to the world.
That's why Sanoderm's here to help. Driven by science and innovation, Sanoderm products have been thoroughly tested and used by doctors and tattoo artists alike for over 10 years.
Sanoderm brings cutting-edge technology to make your tattoo healing process a breeze. No more messing around with cleaning and plastic every few hours with Sanoderm's amazing range of aftercare products. I personally have used Sanoderm to heal my tattoos in the past, and they made what used to be a daily process of setting reminders on my phone to clean and rewrap my tattoo into a one-step process.
Their medical-grade products include aftercare balms, soaps, and my favourite, their second skin aftercare bandages. Sanoderm's tattoo bandages are designed to be waterproof, breathable, and keep your new tattoo protected from whatever the elements can throw at it, so you can get on with your day, worry-free, and confident your new tattoo will look vibrant and will heal faster.
Plus, their products are all natural and ethically sourced, so you can take comfort in knowing that you're healing your tattoos with nature's finest ingredients.
So next time you're in an artist's chair, why not try Sanoderm, healing your tattoos the modern way so you can get on with your day.
Check out the link in the description of this episode for discounts on a range of Sanoderm products or for more information. Kat, you mentioned that like this paper got really close to like an actual like very salient point, but swerved in a different direction. What is that like that truth that they got very close to?
So I think they nearly hit on something when they start talking about costly honest signals, because I think you can interpret tattoos as costly signals, but not of biology. Like
they're really expensive.
Yeah, like they could be a signal for some people of wealth. They could be a signal of how much you care about a specific thing or how committed you are to a group. Like they can be used as a really good show of commitment to an idea or to a group. There was a really good paper that I got about halfway through reading, and then I needed a nap because I'm a child, that looks at like signals of and like costly signals and ideas of subjective commitment and objective commitment, and how when you publicly do a display that I'm really committed to this idea, it makes it harder to back down than if you just sort of internally go, oh, do you know what? I think this. And tattoos could be one of the many ways people can sometimes go like, I'm super committed to this idea or this group. And then backing out is now suddenly not just an internal process. It's like potentially embarrassing. You've told the world. People who are on the opposing side might now shun you because of your tattoo. You've reduced your opportunities for socializing, and you might end up having to spend loads of money getting burnt by lasers to get it off, or
you don't need saliva samples to talk about those kind of things. Like that's definitely more on the kind of psychology side, social psychology, or even sociology side of things, rather than. Like you don't need to like swab people's saliva to think about those questions, right? Sure.
So they're looking at costly signals in a very very biological way. I think costly signal theory can be applied to tattoos in a very psychological way, rather than biological. So that is where they kind of get close to saying something interesting and then hard right at the lights.
Well, I was going to say, as a counterpoint to something you both mentioned, if anyone has ever seen any footballer, you know that people who have lots of money have terrible tattoos. So the people who have no money usually have great tattoos because they spend all their money on tattoos.
That's a good point, actually.
So poorer people are more choosy about their tattoo artist because it's a bigger chunk of their income. Maybe is that what you're proposing?
Sounds like a PhD. Matt, do you want to give me a PhD?
Yeah. Well, hey, I mean, you could be onto something. Like maybe rich people are more likely to get a boatload of crap tattoos, and in a way, that is signaling like I have so much money. I look like a doodle bear from the 90s.
I would argue it's
I
the
don't
I
care.
can
age-old.
afford to ruin my skin.
I would argue it's the age-old
that's,
adage
that
of
again
money
ends
can't
up
buy.
almost being you can think about those inference things the other way around. You know, like people who have tattoos on their face who don't get to be Little Wayne or, you know, Gucci Man or whatever. Like, we don't hear about that, or Post Malone. Sort of bit of survivorship bias there. I wanted to like talk about the other paper that I sent around, because like it's a bit older, but it also it makes up some even bigger claims. It's from 2012, so it's quite old now, but it was published in the Review of General Psychology journal, published by the American Psychological Association, so pretty like a legit journal, I think. And it's called Ultimate Answers to Ultimate Answers. Like, this is what I liked about it and why I picked it to talk about, because it's so kind of confident of itself. Ultimate Answers to Proximate Questions: The Evolutionary Motivations Behind Tattoos and Body Piercings in Popular Culture, by a trio of scholars: Rachel Carman, Amanda Guitar, and Haley Dillon at State University of New York. And I love this because it includes one of my favorite bugbears that makes my teeth itch, where it says, you know, tattoos used to be just for sailors, you know, used to be confined to, once reserved, this is the academic version of it, once reserved for specific subgroups within our culture. And I've been reading examples of that in newspaper headlines since the 1870s. So it does this kind of idea of like false contemporaneity, something that I think also applies to that last paper. But yeah, this also kind of again, maybe we should read the abstract and ask you what you think, Kat. So the abstract here: numerous studies have found piercing and tattooing the body is increasingly prevalent in modern popular culture. However, this is not modern. Evidence of various forms of body ornamentation have been found in human societies dating back thousands of years. Although prior research is focused on the potential relationships between various personality traits and the likelihood of piercing or tattooing the body, few have approached the topic from an evolutionary perspective. Then they say motivations, so symbols of love or group membership or individuality. These motivations are proximate behaviors for an ultimately evolutionary reason: the perpetuation of one's genes. In this article, we propose two new theories about the origins: the human canvas hypothesis and the upping the ante hypothesis. So this is one of the things that this later paper was testing. But it's much more confident in talking about extended phenotypes and costly signaling, and yeah, it even talks about the fact that the navel piercing, which came to prevalence in the 1990s, is also kind of explicable through evolutionary means. So this is one of the sort of feed-ins to that paper we were just talking about. But I thought I wanted to talk about it because it's much more confident, but much less data-driven than that later paper. So yeah, I don't know what do you think about that paper, Kat?
So one of the things that I just have to say out loud is probably my smallest criticism, or the least important criticism that one could possibly have about this paper, is that there's a bit in there where they say that Rachel in Friends gets a tattoo on her abdomen. She doesn't. It's on her hip. It's like, if you like, how can I trust your research in general if you can't even be asked to watch a single fucking episode of Friends? And like, you don't know the difference between an abdomen and your hip. So either you haven't done the research or your understanding of biology is just horrendous, like literally back to front. But anyway, that's
I think that is indicative. Yeah, yeah. I mean,
I was already angry before I got to that point, so
yeah,
I probably reacted even more strongly.
Tom was getting angry with it as well. I mean, I started off angry because
when it got to the section on punk, I was once again on the overground, and I have quite a lot of sociological theories and like political sociology and cultural stuff about punk being one myself. And it's like, it just seems like they just read Google, like when they talked about punk, and they completely missed, the fact that like, it was sociological rebellion rather than some sort of like psychological, like it was much more like of a cultural thing. And it's just like, it just seems like they looked at the cover of London Calling for 5 minutes and just stared at it and said, now I understand punk.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I talked a lot about, why I think this kind of lack of knowledge of tattoos history actually affects a lot of this kind of research. Like, actually, kind of what you were talking about, Kat, as well. Like, there are ways to think about these hypotheses, but they have to start from understanding what the facts of the inputs are. And like this whole paper is like, no one got tattooed before the 1960s, and like the 1990s is when tattooing became trendy, and 2008 piercing and tattooing are mainstream, and like those were things that, I mean, with some degrees of truth and falsity, but like were being reported in the 1890s, like 100 years earlier. And if you acknowledge that and understand that, all the other stuff, it's like goes out the window as well, right? Because you're basing your inferences about the evolutionary reasons for this stuff, or the evolutionary functions for tattooing. You're basing it on incorrect data, right? And go on.
I think that's kind of indicative of like a larger problem in general, partly in any study of humans and human behavior, and partly academia in general, because we're so stuck in our little silos that actually these kind of ideas would really benefit from going like, okay, these are my hypotheses, this is like my understanding of the situation. However, what would a historian of tattoos say about it? What is the cross-cultural understanding of tattoos and bodily modifications? Actually, before I publish this, maybe I should talk to an immunologist as well. But we don't tend to do that, which is in part because academics are frequently just expected to churn information out as fast as possible, which ultimately really reduces the quality and means where we could be making like slow, reasonable steps towards understanding stuff, we're occasionally taking little steps backwards because we're getting all tangled because we're not talking to each other.
Yeah, and like, I mean, I as someone who like is currently head of interdisciplinary studies at the University of Essex, I completely agree with that, right? Although the psychologists at my university are not part of the direct courses that we teach, but like getting people to talk across disciplines is super important for that exact reason, because like, yeah, you end up making really basic mistakes of history and of anthropology and of other branch of science, and then when you kind of mash them together, you end up with really you try and mash them together, you end up in some really strange places. I mean, I was sort of struck by this paper because it like pings around. It gets even the dates it's citing from Margot de Mello's book wrong, like by 200 years in some cases. Ooh. And de Mello herself, is not very good anyway. Oh yeah, 200 years isn't much for you guys.
Like 200 years is fucking nothing to us.
Yeah, this is fine. But like, I mean, even de Mello, whose work is generally pretty good, but she is also not particularly historically contingent because she's a sociologist. So they're drawing upon us like only on one sociologist for all of this history, and they're making these huge leaps of like what they call ritualistic tribal origins into then World War II tattooing. And like, actually, as I've pointed out before, when the Europeans encounter tattooing in the Pacific, literally nothing changes. Like the tattooing that's happening in London pre and post the 1760s is exactly the same. So we don't import the quote unquote tribal tattooing at all. It might look like it if you just look at the fact that the Royal Navy start recording tattooing around the same time. But actually, it's literally the opposite, right? Like the tattooing practices that are happening in Europe do not change. And so to try and go, it begins with this tribal importation that tells us something about, which is again itself really offensive, because it's like, well, it's tribal, therefore it's old, and denying. My friends Sebastian Galliot and Sean Mallon write about this in their book about Samoan tattooing. They're like, this stuff's got a history as well. Like, it gets, just because they're studying it in the 19th century doesn't mean that's what it was like hundreds and thousands of years ago. Like, non-European culture gets to have a timeline as well as just a place, right?
Yeah.
So there's all these kind of mistakes of history, which then get put into this like evolutionary kind of story, which is like, well, it was like that in tribal societies thousands of years ago. Therefore it was like that in Europe. Therefore, it was like that in the 1990s with Rachel from Friends. Therefore, it must be like because of evolution.
And this is something really indicative when I was talking to you, Matt, about this paper. Is like, this feels like it was written by grad students, which you confirmed it was written by grad students.
I think, as far as I could tell, I think like the lead author, I don't think is in academia anymore. But the only web hits I found for her were when she was working as a grad student. So if she went on to an academic post, I don't know. But yeah, it's not. But it is published in certainly a journal that's like got the imprimatur of the APA, who are very good. So you know, I don't know,
like one paragraph, obviously I mentioned the punk thing that just like I read it and it really like stuck out to me. They're talking about, you know, the physical adornment of punks with, you know, safety pins, stick and poke tattoos, and we say, here we see costly signaling in a more extreme form, a visual signal of self-mutilation. Unlike previous subcultures that intended to make statements through the symbols or texts, punks took tattooing and piercing one step further and attempted to display their ideals through self-inflicted physical harm displays, we believe due to the adapted benefits of displaying biological quality. And I'm like, have you ever met a single punk in your life?
Also, like, so that's actually a really good example of what they seem to do quite a lot in this paper, of like, they're saying stuff like, okay, I'm following the logic, and then they just suddenly make this huge leap of like, oh, and therefore that's a display of biological quality. Like, oh, just, no, slow down, take a breath. Let's think, fully explain yourself, please.
It's like the theoretical long jump, you know, you take like 7 really quick steps and then you jump 6 feet forward.
Yep, that is exactly the image that has been in my head from reading this. Yeah, I think one thing I do want to point out, because it's a bit deep into the weeds and nerdy, and I like it.
This is what we like.
So, the title of this paper, if you're unfamiliar with certain bits of oldish biology and behavioral sciences, this title sounds incredibly bombastic. When actually it's making a little nod to something that's known as Tim Bergen's 4 questions.
Interesting.
Which are like the 4 questions of biology. And they kind of get split up into proximate questions and ultimate questions.
Aha.
So that's what they're kind of nodding to. So like your proximate questions are things like, what's the mechanism? What's the obvious causation that's resulted in this? So if you were talking about something like lactation, you'd be looking at, okay, well, what are the hormones involved in lactation? That would be a proximate answer to the question of what's lactation about? There's then ontogeny or development. So if you want to look at lactation and the ontogeny of lactation, you'd be talking about mammary glands and how through a mammal's life, those bits of physiological kit start to exist. And then there's your ultimate questions, which are the kind of long-term whys. And so that would be like the adaptive value of like, well, okay, well, what's the adaptive value of lactating? What problem of survival and reproduction. Could lactation possibly be solving here? And then your other ultimate question is phylogeny, which is like, okay, what is, like, across species, the evolutionary history over millions of years of lactation? So that like if you're not familiar with those questions, that type
so
was
that's
like,
the mistake I make as a non-specialist in go, what is the ultimate reason here?
Like, oh, do you think you've got the answer to the universe, do you? And it's like, well, yeah. I mean, they've also made a choice to use those words. And they've included it and not mentioned Tim Bergen's 4 questions at all. So, like, it's
he's not
understandable,
cited in the reference lists, or there's no references. I mean, because I was sort of also struck reading this, so they come to the conclusion, tattooing and piercing have deep ancestral roots that are expressed through our popular culture. Like, I agree with that. The need to express oneself through body ornamentation transcends all cultural and social barriers. I don't think that's true. And then it says, we're all children of symbolic thought. Yes, that's true. And then the only difference between us is how we choose to express. And then which I think is true. And then they say our deepest evolutionary need. And I think that's not true. So, like, it ends up in weird places. Like, I was struck by something that I came across when I was writing my book, where an art historian pointed out that art historians have to import theories of intention from anthropology because we don't really care why people paint. Like, it's not an interesting question to us. We're just interested in what the painted things produce. And actually, sometimes the search for function, although often in its kind of nicest versions and its most kind of optimistic forms, are intended to avoid kind of cultural chauvinism, can actually end up being really reductive. So if you sort of ask why do you tattoo yourself, you can end up with I think in a strange place sometimes. But, like, ultimately where this paper gets to is like that sentence, like, tattooing is expressed through popular culture. It's like, yes, because tattooing is popular culture, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's why. And if you miss out, for example, the fact that there's this huge link between the birth of a tattoo industry and the fashion for everything Japanese, like, if you try and think about them as separate, if you think about this strange practice of sticking stuff in your skin as separate, you end up in a different place. Like, no, it's just people like these pictures, and actually carrying them around on their bodies is just part of the same cultural impulse. Like, and the other thing that I've talked about, I gave a talk about this at a conference. I gave a talk at an interdisciplinary tattoo scholars conference, where I sort of talk about like how, like, what you shouldn't do when you're doing tattoo research, in my opinion. And one of the things is like this, like, don't do this, because you're going to end up in some weird places. Because there's also this like visibility problem. So if you don't see the tattoos of the past, particularly in Europe, or even if you don't see tattoos in the present or in the near present that under clothing, you're going to have a really different idea about the reasons for, quote unquote, why people get tattooed. And then all of your explanations end up in a weird place. And like, this is what frustrates me about this kind of quite sloppy Evo Psych stuff. Is it like the conclusion here of the paper is like, people like tattoos and they're part of popular culture. It's like, yeah, I don't understand what the kind of over-determination of the reproductive fitness of it does, particularly when you're missing out loads of detail.
Yeah, missing out loads of steps. I think so. I may we can't generalize from a population study of 1, but I have a little hunch that people, or I know I got into evolutionary psychology or using evolution to look at human behavior because I never grew out of being that really annoying kid that wouldn't stop asking why. So that explanation of like, yeah, people get images tattooed on themselves of images that they like. I'm like, yeah, okay, but why? Why are they doing that? And after that, and so this comes back to my idea of like, yeah, the answer is evolution eventually. Like, if you sit there and ask why for long enough, you are eventually going to end up at evolution. But like those steps in between are really interesting, and it's really important not to make big leaps when you've got to make teeny tiny steps. And sometimes those ultimate evolutionary answers are going to be really dull. They're just going to be like, because humans breathe air because you need air, or like I said earlier, humans are just good at learning.
Yeah, and the steps in between are what get the headlines, but as you said, the steps in between are not ultimately the interesting thing. And we've talked today about one, this paper, and then that thing that's cited by our friend Nutri Detective, with the same evidence for the opposite conclusion. Tattooing's good for sexual reproductiveness, and tattooing puts people. Why don't I find tattooed people attractive? Because the savannah, right? Because bees or whatever. And when you're sort of picking which points of that infinitely complex, as you said, data set and history, and with all these kind of intersecting things of biology and history and culture and all of that stuff, when you can sort of stop the wheel and come to a conclusion, if you're not careful and you're not honest about what the data shows, you can literally use the same kind of logic in inverted commas to argue two completely opposite things. And actually, as you said, have you checked? Have you thought about that in a more ultimate way? And I think that way that what you're talking about there of like, yeah, of course, like ultimately there's something evolutionary going on here about who we are as a conscious species of mammal on this particular planet. Like, yeah, that's a beautiful thing, and actually understanding that is really important. Does it frustrate you actually, like, that your field gets kind of there are people in your field who are not as careful and as cautious and as like diligent with the evidence as you are in connecting these evolutionary.
Well, you say
things.
that, but if you haven't read any of my research,
I'm
talking a really good game right now.
Well, we have as I said, we have friends in common, and I trust their who recommended you to come on the show. So I'd heard you on their podcast, and they said they referred me to you, and I trust their judgment on you. So yeah.
But this is one of the mechanisms through which nonsense gets into science. We sort of assume that person is really smart, point. And so we just kind of take that word for it. And because we've all got limited time and limited resources, and I trust that person. They probably didn't lie.
absolutely fair. But it's methodological though, right? I think it's the approach that really interests me. I'm a methodology nerd. I teach methodology to my students, and it's how, and I even as a humanities scholar learn so much by paying attention to scientists whose work I respected on a methodological front, because it's like asking the questions in the right way. And as you've said today, like what frustrates me reading stuff like this, the problems with it become quite obvious just methodologically before you even get to the data. And that seems to be, that's a big discussion in Evo Psych generally, right?
Yeah, well, I think especially something like evolutionary psychology, there's a big question of like, okay, well, what ideas are actually falsifiable here? So one of the kind of cod bits of evolutionary psychology that I occasionally get asked about is this idea that, is it true that people who are attracted to women like boobs because it reminds them of bums?
Yeah, that's the famous one, isn't it?
Such a weird one. Front bum and a back bum, yay? Is that the logic there? Or let's pretend that's a plausible explanation for liking boobs. How do you even begin to try and falsify that idea?
Yeah, right.
Like that idea is almost not worth discussing, because all we have is modern humans, and if you're arguing that all modern humans that are attracted to breasts are attracted to breasts because of bums, I don't even know where you start to try and test that idea. So it's almost not worth asking. And I think sometimes, and there's definitely issues of people coming up with a nice little story that they make sense, and then they go digging for evidence to support their little story.
Or even just plausible,
and so they're doing research
plausible
wrong.
inferences, right? Not even evidence a lot of the time.
Yeah. And it is difficult to sort of pick out the good stuff from the utter nonsense sometimes.
Yeah. Well, this is why you've got a career, Kat, and why we're glad to have you in the field. Right, I've got again, I could keep talking to you forever, but like Tom's got to edit this down, and I could keep chatting to you for ages. We've done this on other episodes with guests. I have so much more I'd love to talk to you about, but we'll have to have you back on again, Kat.
Okay, well, I'll have to do more homework.
Oh, no,
we're reaching the limit of things I know.
Not at all.
We'll just find more terrible articles for you to school us on.
Okay, yeah, I can see that being brilliant for my stress levels. Okay, oh, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for inviting me on and stuff. This has been a lot of fun, and it's always good to have a concrete reason to do a specific bit of research and reading, because there's so much knowledge out there.
Yeah.
There's so much stuff that you could be reading about that having a focal point can be really good.
It's such a busy period of term, so we're super grateful, and just could chat ever.
My online presence isn't that obvious anymore because Twitter died. And Facebook's private. So instead, what I'd recommend is checking out some of the things that I'm adjacent to and sometimes help out with. So that would be Skeptics in the Pub online, which is basically, it's like Skeptics in the Pub, but on the internet. And it kind of started because of lockdowns and stuff. It meant that people across the country that are part of the Skeptics network could still have access to regular, interesting lectures, and we have a virtual pub afterwards as well. So that's a monthly thing, and if you just look, the website address is just sitp.online, and that'll get you to all that information. I also spend a lot of time hanging out with the Merseyside Skeptics people, and they have a bunch of podcasts that are released at varying degrees of regularity. So Skeptics with a K is every other week. Be Reasonable is sometimes monthly, and Incredulous is just whenever the stars happen to align that way. I've heard it referred to as the pitch drop test of podcasts because it's very, very rare and unpredictable. So yeah, just basically skeptic-y stuff.
Yeah, all of them are great. And you write for the Skeptic magazine, don't you, online as well sometimes?
Yeah, very, very much sometimes. And yeah, Marsh, who's the editor, is once more, and I've promised him a lot. But I just keep getting distracted by shiny things and naps.
Yep, solidarity, friend. Solidarity. Okay. Thank you so much, Kat. And we'll speak to you again.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been brilliantly fun.
And if you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, you can check us out on Patreon. That is Beneath the Skin podcast on Patreon. Want to thank our £10 and above listeners: Morpheus Ravenna, Chris Block, Kirsten Wright, Kathleen Burkhardt, Joshua Kent, Jordan Best, Jess Goodman, James Schick, and Charlie Lightning. I used to be able to do this in one breath, but I had a cigarette right before we started recording, so kind of ruined my chances of that. Thank you very much for all of our free listeners for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, you want to hear more, check us out on Patreon. We got bonus stuff. We got the episodes like this early, and you help support the show. And you can find us on Instagram at Beneath the Skin Pod. It's a thank you very much from me and Matt.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.